Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first online Europaeum alumni seminar. I'm Anthony Teasdale from the Europaeum, and with me is Andrew Graham, who's the chair of the Europaeum. And we're delighted to launch this series of events, which are directed primarily at the 2,000 or so people who have participated over the years in Europaeum programs of various kinds, and others who are part of what we like to call our wider Europaeum community. That's of friends and associates who are part of or associated with in some way this network. What is the network? For those of you who are new to this process, the Europaeum is an alliance. It's technically an association of 17 leading universities across Europe. It was set up about 30 years ago, and it combines, it's a great kind of unique international initiative that brings together not only some of the finest academic institutions in Europe and indeed in the world, but some of the continent's best and brightest young minds, connecting them across disciplines, across cultures, and across countries. And this seminar series is designed primarily to look at big public policy issues and leadership questions as they affect the modern world. And nothing is bigger or more important at this moment than the recent events in the United States and the implications of the second Trump administration, not only for America, but for Europe and the world. And of course, Europe is particularly affected by this, and therefore it's a delight to have with us four really distinguished experts who are leading figures in analyzing what's going on transatlantically, internationally, and also within the United States. What's the meaning of this in terms of today's politics and historically? People talk about landmark elections in the United States, 1932, arguably 1980. Will 2024 be seen as one of those real turning points in US history? Or is this the consolidation of a process which has already started? So we'll be addressing these and many other issues, including, of course, the huge implications for so many jurisdictions across the world. But before doing that, I'd like to invite Dr. Andrew Graham, to say now chair of the Europaeum, former master of Balliol College here in Oxford University. We're broadcasting this from St. Antony's College in Oxford, which Oxford is one of the 17 universities. I'd like to ask Andrew to say a little bit about this series and the Europaeum more generally.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to everybody. I know from the list of people who are participating that quite a lot of you have seen me and know me already, but there are equally a very large number of names of people I don't know. Anthony's already said that I've become the chair of the Europaeum trustees, and that's a great honor. I'm following Chris Patton, who stood down just a few months ago. And as Anthony has already said, I was master of Balliol College in the University of Oxford for just over a decade. I've had an extraordinarily fortunate life. Before that, a period I was advisor to the British Prime Minister, and then I was, again, by a series of extraordinarily good bits of things coming together, I was able to found the Oxford Internet Institute. But the Europaeum is where we are now, and that's what matters now. And I have to say that I find today, I've had a lot of exciting things happening in my life, but today is pretty exciting. Why? Because this is the first event that I've chaired or introduced as the chair of the trustees. So, the sort of adrenaline's running a little bit, gets one going. The second thing is that this is the first of a new initiative, which Anthony has very much pushed, which I greatly welcome, a series of quarterly online digital seminars. So that's a first. And the third thing is that Anthony and I have been having extremely useful discussions with the newspaper, the New European. And we're expecting to work quite closely with them over the weeks and months and years ahead. And we're very much hoping that the panelists who are contributing today will be writing up something drawn from their pieces, and that those will be published in the European. So we will see things going on from beyond this. And I'll come back at the end of my remarks to why I think that's so significant. So I'm excited for all of those reasons. New things happening, that's always gets the blood going. The event, as everybody knows, is about Trump. And I do have three things to say, or possibly not say, about that. Point number one is everything I want to say about Trump is unprintable. So I'm going to leave it in that zone, exactly unlike Donald Trump. I won't say all the rude things that are on my mind. The second thing is I want to recall a remark that was made to me. I expect many of you have heard it. But someone once said to me, if we don't hang together, we will certainly hang separately. And that's undoubtedly where we are in relation to Trump at the moment. And the third thing I want to say, and this brings us back to the role of the Europaeum and why we're collaborating with the new European. And by the way, please, if you're inclined to do so, they're remarkably good value. Take out a subscription. Let me promote them. They're promoting us. I'm happy to promote them. But what brings me back to the Europaeum and to the European, both of these things, is that we engage academics with the external world. We don't believe that the world is God-given. It's up to us to shape the world. And so one of the enormous important purposes of seminars like this is that people will draw on the ideas that our four panelists will put forward and think what to do in the light of them. Be better informed, be better able to engage, and be forming the world consistently with the set of values to which we all subscribe. And at that point, I will stop or I'll start saying unprintable things about Mr. Trump. And I'll pass over to Anthony, who's going to introduce the four panelists. But I'm looking forward enormously to listening to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's much appreciated. Let's go straight now down to business. And let's invite the first of our four distinguished panelists and experts in the field to share her thinking about the implications of Donald Trump's return to power for not only America, but Europe and the world. And that is Leslie Vinjamuri, who is a leading foreign policy expert, a former practitioner, director of the US and Americas program at Chatham House, and a professor of international relations at SOAS in the University of London. She previously taught at Georgetown School of Foreign Service in Washington, DC, and previously held jobs in USAID, or USAID as I think it's technically known, and the Congressional Research Service in Washington, DC. Leslie, how do you see things?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's great. I can't see everybody who's on the call, but I've seen your names and it's really lovely to meet all of you, and especially the leaders of this. I really welcome the remarks by you, Andrew, and Anthony. And I'm very curious to hear what others have to say. And I admire Ian's bookshelves. So with that said, I guess let me say a couple of things. We're only 10 days in to the second Trump administration, if I count right. I've lost count. It feels like much longer than that. Because of the level of activity is one word to use. But before I say a few more serious remarks, I mean, I probably share many of your feelings, Andrew, and I think I aim to share your level of restraint, and I have great respect for it. I would, and I know you'll feel the same, I would add the caveat that, as we all know, 77 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. Just under 75 million, if I'm right on the count, I'm pretty sure I am, voted for Kamala Harris. But 77 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, and they all have a very significant stake in America, in America's democracy, in America's economy. They voted for multiple different reasons, even if the polling told us the top issue was the economy and the inflation. They still have a variety of reasons for voting for him. They come from a variety of backgrounds, from the uber wealthy to the, lower income echelons of society. They come from different ethnic and recent immigrant groups to to many white Americans. So it's a diverse constituency. There's lots to say about it, but I think that the most important thing that we can do as we think analytically and scholarly terms and policy terms and as people is to engage with the US president in a serious way, because he was the product of a very democratic process, however flawed with respect to information and many things. Anybody that was elected was going to emerge from the flaws and the successes of America's democracy, and he's emerged. So this is my first feeling when he was elected was, okay, this is real. This isn't, this wasn't a mistake. Donald Trump, although we don't know exactly what he will do, we have a lot of information about him by this point, since he has been president before and had a considerable and ongoing influence, not only over the Republican Party when he was out of office, but also over the United States of America writ large. So, second thing I would say, that's sort of a caveat. I guess the first thing I would say is when I think about Trump and what Trump means for Europe and for the United States and for the world, I try as best I can, and it's very difficult to do, but I think it's something we have to continue to aim for, is to differentiate where America is heading, and it's been heading for some time, and what's distinct about Trump. And then on the Trump question, where was he before? And we all know there's a difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, which isn't just Trump, it's, the administrations look different. And then thirdly, the world is different. So the context is different. So when we say, what does it mean for the rest of the world? I don't think that we can assume that everything is about Donald Trump. It's a complex democracy. It's a complex economy. And I would date it at around from Obama's election, which coincided with the 2008 financial crisis, which revealed very high levels of inequality in the United States and gave political energy at the highest, most visible levels of American politics to that grievance over questions of a loss of manufacturing, an economic downturn for lower echelons of America's electorate, really gave that political impetus and fed into an already developing sentiment against some of the fundamental assumptions that had underpinned the international order since the end of the Second World War, although this had developed. So there's been on certain dimensions a long time coming, and we know that, but I think it's important to always remind ourselves America had already been moved against free trade. Donald Trump in his first administration locked that position in and gave it a certain kind of political force. America was already becoming self-critical of its engagement in wars of choice, in its over-engagement in very costly wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was already a move, and Obama came into office wanting to reduce the US footprint in the Middle East. And although China's share of the global economy has continued to grow, it's much higher now than it was when Obama entered office. Even as early as in 2009, when he took the oath of office, he was focused on China and on the Indo-Pacific. He had a different strategy, but that desire to shift America's strategic and geopolitical focus and to think differently about the economy were brewing. And Donald Trump came into office, consolidated those things in the first term, and built on the opportunity of the COVID crisis to really strengthen the anti-China sentiment in the United States. So what is different now without his background? And I'll just take the next 5 minutes to say what I think is different now. I do think that the second Trump administration is very different, and that it has different implications for the United States and different implications for Europe. The second Trump administration, as we know, has been not necessarily the president, but the people around him have been working for a long time to prepare plans for across the whole of government, from education to defense to diplomacy, to labor and human rights and development assistance and so on. And those plans are being rolled out. So there is a strategy and a degree of coherence to the thinking. And the thinking starts like this. America, and this will be familiar, but just to remind ourselves, America has not benefited from the international order that it created. It has paid a high price and not received the benefit, and others have received the benefit of that system, not only China, but also America's friends, America's partners and allies. And it's time to work unilaterally and transactionally to get those things back. Secondly, to get that benefit back to America in the first instance. If the old bet was America benefits in the medium and long term by extending and supporting a rules-based order, the new bet is that America needs to benefit in the first instance. It needs not to be deferred gratitude, because deferred gratitude has not paid off for the United States, and the policies are following from that. Secondly, there is clearly a big bet and a strong view that the US executive branch has not supported the president in his desire to execute either on his foreign or domestic policy agenda. And therefore, both the waste and the ideology that is deeply rooted in the US executive branch needs to be rooted out and rethought. And that is why we're seeing, albeit with a lot of chaos and back and forth, the Office of Management and Budget stop all federal funding. That's temporarily been halted because it hadn't been cleared with the White House, while we've seen foreign assistance, with a few exceptions, food security assistance, I believe, halted. And really the beginning of what looks like could be a radical restructuring of the executive branch. And that ultimately matters not only for Americans, it matters for the world, because a lot of $64 billion, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the number I've most recently seen on US foreign assistance halted. It has a very significant impact. Last couple of minutes, what else is different? So Project 2025 is kind of, the term that we've used to encapsulate both that philosophical approach to the democratically elected president's right to have an executive branch that works with him to implement his agenda. That is the philosophical commitment at the heart of what we are seeing now, which is beginning to try and root out the waste, the excess, and the ideological incoherence. Some people call it the absence of loyalty from the executive branch. What else is different? Some things are the same. The use of economic statecraft, especially tariffs, to get what the president wants across, and here's the rub, across the range of domains, not just to reduce the bilateral trade deficit with certain countries, but also to push on security and defense spending. You're not spending enough, we're going to slap tariffs. You're not taking deportees on America's military planes, Colombia, we're going to slap tariffs on you. You're letting fentanyl come across the southern border, we're going to slap tariffs on you. So the coercive use of the threat, and we will see potentially the promise, February 1st, Mexico and Canada, of tariffs is right up there in a categorically different way than it was in 1.0. Secondly, the claims on sovereignty, to me, look different in Trump 2.0 with very significant implications. Panama Canal, Greenland, and Canada, the opening gambits. And it's about the sea lanes, it's about shipping, it's about geopolitics, and it's about saying we don't respect the sovereignty norm, President Trump, and we are going to begin to shift how you think about what's rightfully eligible for change on the map and what the strategy is for going about that. It might seem like a crazy thing. I think this is the beginning of him trying to really shift people's attention. And then final comment, I'll just say, we all know that this is the geopolitical moment, and Donald Trump would like to be the geopolitical president. Will he get, the grand bargain, the deal of a century in the Middle East that he'd like to see? It requires, for Trump to do that, regional partners to be willing to sell the Palestinians on the question of Palestinian sovereignty, probably down the river, because that's basically where President Trump seems to be in his level of commitment to a two-state solution or even an intelligent one-state solution. And very final comment on Ukraine and Russia. There are multiple scenarios, but what we do know is that the consequences for Europe are vast, and they're playing out already because of the level of uncertainty over what Donald Trump will or won't do has fundamentally eroded the norms of diplomacy, certainty, predictability, rules that really make, even in a challenging time, for a better degree of outcome in the international sphere. So it is an extraordinary moment. I'll stop there and come back in the questions. Looking forward to hearing what others have to say.
Many thanks, very many thanks, Leslie, for setting the scene so effectively. Now we're going to look at one very particular aspect, I think, of this, which is more kind of political and ideological, the underpinnings in a way of what's been going on. Dr. Suzanne Schneider joins us. She's Deputy Director of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research in New York City and currently a visiting fellow at Kellogg College in the University of Oxford. And she's written very widely on the far right, the new right in international politics, indeed coined the phrase the illiberal international, as well as writing on Middle Eastern politics and risk and religion in contemporary politics. So, Suzanne, how do you interpret these recent events and how worried should we be about the future?
Well, thanks very much, Anthony and Andrew and everyone at Europaeum for inviting me, everyone at home who's choosing to spend the day with us. I'm going to try to address these questions kind of with three major parts. So the first is a very kind of quick appraisal of, what's been happening, which I won't belabor because I think Leslie has done a very good job at walking us through some of those developments. I want to spend a bit more time walking through some of the high level developments that I see that are really seismic on a global level, and that I believe the Trump 2.0 era really cements. Not that it creates, but that it cements. And then I'll finally offer a very few closing remarks on how allies, particularly Europe, might respond. Though I'll leave most of that to my other panelists who kind of work in that field a little bit more than I. But so we're barely a week into the second administration, and they are moving very swiftly to implement key parts of this agenda. As of my last count, the administration's issued 44 executive orders, repealed dozens of those that were issued by the Biden administration, and many of these moves were anticipated and kind of fell under very broad and overlapping categories related to immigration, the culture wars, which kind of also bled into federal workforce and spending. There's a few very telling economy-related orders so far, particularly on energy, AI, and crypto. And then, of course, a number of orders relating to foreign relations, which is possibly of more interest today, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, again, the WHO, scaling back, reassigning foreign aid. There's a new kind of direct foreign policy directive to the Secretary of State that American kind of foreign policy needs to be guided by an American first principles. So anyway, how do we make sense of this? What does it all mean? So yes, on the one hand, we're facing an administration that I think is a lot better prepared than it was the first time around. And I think it's important to remember that I don't think at least Trump has an ideological center beyond belief in his own greatness, but the people around him certainly do. And they have spent the last 8 years trying to hitch their agenda to his charismatic leadership and to curry favor by cultivating the next generation of post-liberal policy wonks. So there exists today a massive ideological and institutional infrastructure that simply wasn't there in 2016. Organizations like American Moment, American Compass, the Edmund Burke Foundation, Conservative Partnership Institute, to say nothing of the Project 2025. So it's going to be a very different situation this time around, which is not necessarily to mean a less tumultuous one. Because in particular, this administration is going to be shaped by an intense rivalry between two new right factions battling for the president's ear, neither of which embraces the mainstream conservative agenda. So in my work on the new right, I've called this the battle between the engineers and the traditionalists. And you've no doubt seen headlines recently about cracks in the MAGAverse over the H-1B visa issue, and this kind of feud between Elon Musk and former Trump strategist Steve Bannon. So this is the tip of really a much larger kind of ideological iceberg. And I want to say a little bit about this rivalry today, because I think it will help us grasp what I view to be a most important lesson at this point, that ironically, the neoliberal world order that was inaugurated by the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions has not been bested by the socialists, but is being dismantled from the right. And what this means is that everything is up for grabs in a way that I don't think we have seen for decades. So on the one hand, you have kind of the traditionalists who have coalesced around the national conservatism movement, which was helmed by the Israeli-American political theorist Yoram Hazony. So, lest you thought that no one paid attention to political theorists, Hazony's movement's really become an umbrella for all of these facets of the global right, has made significant inroads with figures like Viktor Orban, Suella Braverman, and a number of US senators, including our new Vice President, J.D. Vance, who's been a regular at NatCon meetups since 2019. So I've argued that the new nationalists are ironically the new internationalists, and they far outstrip their rivals on the left in terms of global coordination. And aided by a new circuitry of illiberal institutions, ideas and practices migrate rapidly from one country to the next, even as ideologues stress the singular distinctiveness of each nation's history and culture. So, for example, attacks on judicial independence, which began in Israel in the 1990s and accelerated during the Second Intifada, provided inspiration for Viktor Orban, who in turn further emboldened the Netanyahu government to pursue the controversial judicial overhaul package in the spring of 2023, now with help and funding of organizations explicitly modeled on the American Federalist Society. So one simply can't tell this story while remaining within the national boundaries that are so sacred to the kind of partisans of the new right. So that means our perspective has to be global if we wish to grasp the nature of this post-liberal project whose constituent pieces are being assembled not just in Western capitals, but indeed across the global South. So when I started working on the NatCon movement several years ago, I was surprised to see how much thinkers in this world had co-opted left-wing critiques of capitalism and more generally embraced a historical materialist view of the relationship between economic conditions and social forms. So, I was at the 2023 conference in London, and I watched speaker after speaker get up and sound much more like Wolfgang Streeck than Milton Friedman, rebuking the degrading effects of capitalism on families and communities and calling for states to intervene. And in the United States, Orrin Cass of American Compass has done the most to advance this position, proposing everything from direct cash payments to parents to sectoral bargaining to boost the power of organized labor. Now, behind all of these calls, there lies a real break with the principles of liberal economic organization, starting with the idea of autonomous utility maximizing individuals that sits at the heart of mainstream economic models. So reaching back to an older form of conservatism centered on the family, the community, and the nation, the traditionalists do not regard the individual as a key social unit, nor do they believe that states exist primarily to secure individual rights. Likewise, they dismiss the idea that the market is the optimal distributor of social goods or that economic values are the preeminent ones. So the traditionalists have been crucial in terms of electoral politics by speaking to a populist economic agenda that does resonate with many Americans. But implementing their agenda would require breaking with the conservative donor class that controls access to public office, and I would not bet against capital in this horse race. But in their battle for primacy, it's not just the Wall Street Journal editorial board with whom they must contend, but also the group of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, colloquially known as the Broligarchs, or in my terms, the engineers. So for our purpose, I'm not going to go, just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go super far into the kind of, the libertarian or faux libertarian philosophy really behind this crew. But what's noteworthy is that this very influential group of men also has soured on the free market in key ways. And here I don't just gesture at the monopolistic tendencies of the tech giants. They are devotees to what the philosopher Curtis Yarvin, who's just started to get a lot of attention actually in the mainstream press as well, has called turbo capitalism, where maximizing profit depends on seizing the state apparatus and the public purse. So invocations of laissez-faire are notably absent. They've given up the libertarian lie that business can thrive without the state and are far more interested in conquering it, not just via regulatory capture, but by directing industrial and economic policy and positioning their preferred firms as national champions. So this is the proper context in which to consider the appointment of venture capitalist David Sachs as a new AI and crypto czar, or to understand J.D. Vance's suggestion that the U.S.'s commitment to European defense hinges on EU regulatory bodies lying off of Twitter, or X. So This is not the free market, but the patronage market. And it should look eerily familiar to those of us who have worked on the global south, or indeed the history of royal monopolies. So, what does it mean? Well, I see these two ascendant factions of the American right that really do advance fundamentally different economic and social visions, but both reject the neoliberal economic orthodoxies about free markets and the role of the state in economic life. And in my eyes, this break is a seismic one. And there is no hope of rolling the clock back to 1995, 2005, or even 2015, or hoping that President Pete Buttigieg will restore order in 2028. Right? Many of us tend to think in terms of these systems that are, if not permanent, still regarded as more or less stable features of the international order. And much of what happens under the auspices of foreign policy and economic development is explicitly designed to ensure the longevity of that order. I think we have to kind of be very honest with the fact that it's over. I really don't see, I really see this as a seismic break, not as a kind of little bump in the road. And so two final kind of thoughts on that note for our European friends, especially. Right? It's often said that Trump is an isolationist, but I think that that's wrong. Right? It's far more accurate to describe him as a unilateralist who will not hesitate to engage in this highly interventionist foreign policy. But he won't ask permission, but he will demand loyalty. He certainly does not take a rules-based international order seriously and will not be swayed by appeals to legal or institutional norms, or indeed, as Leslie mentioned, the sovereign claims of other states. He's simply not constrained by the imaginative contours of the end of history era of policymaking, and is in fact brazen enough to try to redraw the political map. So his inaugural speech promising to expand our territory, to take back the Panama Canal, right? We have these remarks about possibly annexing Canada, conquering Greenland. These statements very well may seem deranged, but that does not make them insincere. And just last Sunday, he suggested that Palestinians in Gaza be forcibly removed to other countries, a proposal cheered by members of the Israeli right who have been on team ethnic cleansing for decades now. So the promise to end the war in Ukraine almost certainly involves accepting the Russian acquisition of territory by force. Again, everything is up for grabs. And it is only by keeping this in mind that we can move beyond the paralyzing shock that such things are still possible in the 21st century. So in closing, I'll say there's nothing kind of permanent about this world order that many of us have taken for granted. The free market, the stability of international borders, the illegality of war. We cannot be afforded to be amazed when such conventions are cast aside as little more than social niceties. And this fact is both terrifying and uniquely challenging, I think, for the European states. And I'll let others kind of with more expertise speak on this front, but it does seem to me that Europe will have to position itself as a counterweight to American power, that it must be united to do so, which will require looking critically at the kind of democratic deficits of its own institutions like the EU and the EP that undermine their legitimacy with publics at home. It must be prepared to leverage access to the European market in order to exert pressures on other governments, and it must not grovel before this new administration, because I do not think that a man who believes in peace through strength will be swayed by weakness. So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Suzanne. Very thought-provoking, very interesting set of remarks, and of course identifying the potential for a real system change that we're now witnessing, and a challenge to, in a way, what both Leslie and Suzanne have focused on, which is there is no sense, or seems to be very little sense, in the new administration of what you might see as global collective public goods. Collective goods which in many ways were generated by United States power, and from which the United States, many of us around this digital table, feel benefited for many decades. And no one better really to analyze the implications of that, particularly for transatlantic relations, but more widely than Ian Lesser. Ian Lesser is Distinguished Fellow and Advisor to the President and a former acting president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, heading up the GMF's office in Brussels, where he writes and talks about European policy, about US foreign policy, about transatlantic relations, and is a former practitioner in all of these things, having been himself in the RAND Corporation, in the US Department of State, where he worked on policy planning, and having taught and researched at the Woodrow Wilson Center in DC. Ian, based on what you've heard so far and your reflections on the current scene, would you like to share your insights and thinking on how things have gone and how they may yet develop.
Anthony, Andrew, thank you very, very much. It's very nice, and especially nice if you'll allow me to say to see the St. Antony's College background, since I have a connection as well. So it's a nostalgic experience as well as a very interesting one today, and to see my friends on the screen as well. Look, I mean, it's very simple at this point. I can only sort of agree with all the things I've been hearing. It's left me with not that many things to say, but let me say some anyway. Anyway, three thoughts about this, and they relate to things that I think we've already heard. I mean, the first, I was going to make the point that's already been made, I think, by the two earlier speakers, that the first experience of the Trump administration is only a very limited guide to what we're going to see now. That I totally agree with that for all sorts of reasons. Most of them have been mentioned. They simply, the people around him, they know how to pursue this agenda. It's much more ideologically driven than it was. Sure, there are certain characteristics of this that are centered on his mercurial personality and all the rest of it that are still there. But basically, you've got a lot of people now who know how to do this. There may be legal challenges, as we've seen, but they understand how to, sort of weaponize, if I can say, executive orders and other things in order to pursue this agenda. And the agenda is in a way explicitly revolutionary, as we've already, discussed. I think it also illustrates something which we often sort of gloss over, which, because in the context of some similar political developments in Europe, it's not just a revolt against political elites, a populist revolt against elites and their projects like trade agreements and alliances. It's also, I would say, a civil war among American elites, in part because there is so much money in our system, in our political, embedded in our system. But you also see it in other ways that have already been described. And I think that's worth bearing in mind, because they could have, there are potential fractures there that are worth thinking about. It's also, I think, worth thinking about all of these staffing questions and appointment questions and all the rest of it, not just in the context of what they mean in terms of ideology or professionalism, but also, what happens when something goes seriously wrong? Because things do go seriously wrong. Another sort of Cuban Missile Crisis style contingency. We can imagine things in Asia. We can imagine things with Russia over Ukraine, all sorts of things that can go wrong. Who is going to be around the table? What is the quality of decision making? I just leave those as open questions, but I think they are much more open questions than they might have been with previous administrations. The second point I'd make, and it's been made already actually, is that it's not about isolationism. If we think about the foreign policy piece of this, it is, as you say, Suzanne and Leslie also alluded to this, it's about unilateralism, it's about nationalism. And of course, the United States is not alone in that approach these days, but it's certainly that. Maybe a more, when it comes to at least Trump's own outlook, a relatively kind of parsimonious approach to American military power. I don't think he is an interventionist in the sense that, that Europeans sometimes looked at the last Bush administration and saw it as interventionist, thinking about, a sort of careless use of American military power. I don't think that's his thing. He is much more about economic warfare, and I'll come back to that in a second. Other things regionally, Europe is not at the top of his agenda, I think, or that of others in his administration. Asia certainly is. China is, and of course, in this respect, there is some broad consensus. I mean, there are very few things that Republicans and Democrats agree on these days, but a harder line on China is probably one of them. And I think this administration certainly embodies that kind of a view. Will they engage with China? Certainly, yes. Will they engage in a very tough, hard-minded way? Certainly. Is Europe a stakeholder in the outcome of that? Absolutely, whether we're talking about trade or security. But I think that is, in a sense, the center of gravity of where this administration will be going in terms of international policy. What is the lens through which Trump sees the world? It's not about institutions, definitely not. Definitely not. And that has implications for the EU. It has implications for NATO, for trade agreements and other things. It's only maybe partly about nation states, although he clearly has his likes and dislikes, but it's really about individual leaders. And that has some implications in the end, for how Europe in particular can engage or not with this administration, because he is very personality driven in that respect. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. I mean, just a comment about the European Union here. I mean, if you had to sort of rank, sort of losers in a sense of the current approach, EU has to, I'm very sorry to say this, Anthony. I mean, the EU is sort of at the top of that list in the sense that not because the EU isn't influential or powerful in certain respects, if it wanted to be, but because very different to the Biden administration, which was very prepared to see the EU as an interlocutor on many different things, even where it wasn't absolutely necessary to do that. And there were very close relationships between the White House and President von der Leyen's cabinet, for example. I think that's going to be very different. I think that's going to be way down the list for the current crew. That will be very different. And by the way, it wasn't so high on the list for Obama either, in terms of his own outlook, So anyway, burden sharing, clearly, but all administrations come with a burden sharing message to Europe, but it's going to be very pointed. It'll be very sharp, unpleasant. Will European members of NATO be able to get up to the 5% that the Trump administration talks about? Certainly not, of GDP. Will they get closer to 3.5 or 3? Quite possibly some like Poland are already beyond that. But there's a combination of things there. It's the US pushing, it's a war in Europe, it's their own anxieties and so on. But if you do get to those higher numbers, I won't say too much about it. There will be a much more interesting debate about what you count. And I'll just leave that there. Finally, I think, and this has been mentioned already, I think this administration is very comfortable with making an explicit linkage between not just economic issues, but also commercial, actual business issues and foreign and security policy. The idea that how US companies are treated in Brussels in regulatory terms will shape our willingness to commit to European security. And this is something new. I mean, some of these things were implicit, they were in the background in previous years. No one would put it that way. But now this administration does. Economic warfare. You don't have to be too into the historical analogies, but between the wars, virtually every major power had a ministry of economic warfare. So just like that combination of nationalism and socialism, if I can put it that way, isn't entirely new. This isn't entirely new either. It doesn't lead us to a good place. A final point about how to engage. I think simply hoping for the best and waiting to see what happens is not going to be the way. I think for Europe in particular, you've got to go and engage with him. I think we don't know what the result will be, but I think that's sort of the way to think about it. And then, of course, the other piece, which we can talk more about, is the United States and the transatlantic relationship is more than just the relationship between Washington and national capitals or Brussels. There's a huge set of stakeholders in this that include states and cities and businesses and civil society. I mean, this was a little bit what happened in the first Trump administration. It can be very useful on certain kinds of things like energy policy and climate and environment. Doesn't take you too far on things like arms control and burden sharing, but all this to be tested.
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's really very insightful and stimulating. And I loved your phrase, if I may say, civil war among American elites, as much as
let me also add, it's not entirely mine. I don't know if he phrased it exactly that way, but David Brooks, in a very thoughtful piece in the New York Times several years ago, basically outlined that. So
yeah. I had the privilege of being in the United States on election day last November, and had a slightly surreal experience of going from Columbia University, where I do some teaching, down to Wall Street, where I met somebody at Goldman Sachs who was about to go out and vote for Kamala. And he said to me, there's an awful lot of people in this city and beyond who may make a lot of money out of what occurs if Donald Trump gets back to power. And I think it was a very important insight. Talking of economics, that brings us quite naturally to Jakob Funk Kirkegaard, who when I was in Brussels, when I was with the EPRS, really struck a chord with us in being one of the few economists who was saying the Eurozone is robust enough to survive the crisis, and who pinpointed, earlier than many, some of the structural weaknesses in the Chinese economy. He's a senior fellow at Bruegel, the economic think tank in Brussels, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, DC, at which for many years he was a resident fellow, so has an excellent insight into the US economy as well as the European and global ones. Jakob, what's your perception of the way things are moving, and how concerned should we be?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What I think in terms of, Trump and the economy, I think, you have to approach that with a certain sense of humility, in the sense that I think it was Alan Beatty who wrote in the FT, no one knows anything. So let that be my starting point. So when I will talk about, what the Trump economic agenda might do, I have no priors to what it will be. I can only say that I'm sort of talking based on the types of topics that Trump has articulated most frequently. Does that bestow any kind of, relevance? I simply don't know. So I think in terms of the degree of uncertainty, if you look at what might pass this Congress, where obviously the Republican control of the House is razor thin, is extremely uncertain. But let me say that if you look at Donald Trump since he re-entered the presidential race, I would say that there are probably three items that he has returned to again and again. The first one is, of course, and he's not the only one in his party who always talks about that, is, of course, more tax cuts, or more, or making his existing tax cut at least permanent, which is another way of saying that we need more fiscal stimulus in the United States. Secondly, what he has talked about repeatedly, and was already mentioned, tried to use it as a tool to achieve other political aims, is, of course, tariffs. And then finally, the last, I would say, macroeconomically relevant item is deportations. We don't know the extent of any of these. To date, they have been restrained, I guess I would say. Certainly not, a bazooka on day one. But I think if he goes down, all three of them, they share one macroeconomic similarity. They're all inflationary, and potentially significantly so. Obviously, if you give further tax cuts in an economy that already runs a federal government budget deficit of 6 to 7%, if you are actually serious about deporting millions of workers from an economy that is already at full employment, that will potentially drive up labor costs in key sectors, food, hospitality, etc., agriculture significantly. And if you're serious about trade tariffs, including, it was already mentioned, potentially against America's closest trading partners in Mexico and Canada, 25% later this week. Canada is the biggest supplier of energy to the United States. So if you want to drive up the US gasoline prices at the pump, there's nothing better than to put a 25% tariff on Canadian crude oil imports. So anyway, if he does all these things, you will have inflation, and you will have more of it. And for those of you who listened to Jay Powell last week, when he said, we're not going to cut interest rates, we're going to wait and see. Now, he didn't, of course, say that we're going to wait and see and not do anything until we know what Trump is going to do, but that's what he really said. And of course, Trump already got mad. So, you know, what does this mean? I think there's a real risk of overheating. If he actually goes ahead and does all these things, I think there's a real risk of the US economy overheating and entering into sort of a boom-bust cycle. So what does that mean for the rest of the world? It means for Europe and for everybody else, I think, you know, when I think about the trade war, there is sort of a often repeated and erroneous statement, namely to say that the US will always win the trade war because they are the deficit country. You know, they will put on tariffs, they will import less, and that means they will win. Well, I think that assessment is what economists like to call partial equilibrium analysis. It doesn't take into consideration the broader macroeconomic circumstances of the United States at the moment and its main trading partners, Europe, China, etc. I would actually contend that the US will lose, quote unquote, a trade war or a tariff war with the rest of the world because the broader macroeconomic impact of such a trade war will be much more detrimental to the US economy, given where it is today, than the effects would be on the European economy, for instance. Because remember, there's first of all, Trump goes crazy and he imposes 20% tariffs on all imports to the United States. This is not the 1930s. It is not. Because nobody else is going to do it to each other. There might be some that retaliates against the United States, but we're not going to have this everybody tariffing everybody else like we saw in the 1930s. What we're going to be seeing is the US trading a lot less with the rest of the world. We've already seen that with China. The US is trading a lot less with China because of the tariffs, both under Trump one and of course of Biden. Well, that's kind of a negative trade agreement, a negative FTA between, you know, the US and China. It has meant more trade through third countries, Vietnam, Mexico, etc. But the point is, this is not the 1930s. It's simply wrong to make that equation. So what Trump, if he does this, will do is he will hurt, potentially overheat the US economy. What will happen in Europe? Well, there will be some German car companies, etc., that will be in trouble. Fine, they're already in trouble. Okay. The ECB will cut rates faster, probably deeper. The euro will drop, which will directly counter the effects of tariffs. And that will basically be it. The EU today runs a global current account surplus of 3% of GDP. That is, you know, in dollar terms, twice the size of the Chinese. It's very, very big. So yes, it will hurt, but will it be a disaster? No. Will it lead to mass unemployment or recession in the European Union? No, it will not. Does those policies have that potential if it overheats the economy in the US to do so? Yes, it does, in my opinion. So when the rest of the world, and particularly Europe, looks to Trump and his threats of trade tariffs, etc., I'm always reminded of, you know, John Paul II telling the Poles, do not be afraid. We should not be afraid of this. It's not actually such a huge macroeconomic disaster as a lot of people would make it. The real macroeconomic impact may very well be felt on the United States. So that's sort of the macroeconomy. By the way, Anthony, you just stop me when I go on. I kind of lost track of time. The other thing is that
maybe 3 to 4 minutes. If we close the first round,
yeah, okay, sure.
the hour, then we have half an hour for Q&A though.
Then of course, you know, economically, Trump does offer some other opportunities for Europe. There's no doubt that his return will spur, I mean, Ian already talked about that, the formation or the increase in European defense expenditures. I would also say that I think it will greatly accelerate the integration of Ukraine, the military-industrial complex in Ukraine into that of the rest of Europe. But that's slightly a separate issue. Then this week in Brussels, we have had the launch of, you know, what the European Commission called the competitiveness compass. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means it has one similarity, I would argue, with the Trump agenda, and that is deregulation. Because obviously in the Trump agenda, deregulation is intimately linked with essentially gutting the federal government or the Department of Government Efficiency or whatever this so-called department means. Now in Brussels, it's called something else. They call it horizontal enablers of competitiveness, which you know, is of course a terrible Brussels jargon, but what it basically means is deregulation. There is clearly in this incoming commission a sense, and I think rightly so, that a lot of that there has been over-regulation associated with the green transition, associated with a lot of other recent initiatives, or well, recent in the last couple of years, deforestation, the supply chain sustainability directive, etc. So I think there will be significant deregulation, or at least attempts to it. I mean, we've had this rather unprecedented situation that of all the French government, of all, requested that the EU, as they say, you know, indefinitely suspended, also means ditching, in plain English, the directive for sustainable supply chain management or supervision. When the French tells you to deregulate, you kind of think, well, maybe you have overdone it, right? Similarly, the EU recently, or they announced that they were going to restart free trade negotiations with Malaysia. Why is that important? It's important because what that means is that the so-called deforestation directive that the EU implemented, and basically forcing everybody that exports timber and other things to the EU to prove that these things were not related to areas that has been forest that has been cut down, will essentially be gutted, because otherwise Malaysia would never want to negotiate such a deal with it. So, but what this also, by the way, highlights is that exploiting the continued absence of the United States from the global trade arena, the EU is pretty busy continuing to negotiate free trade agreements. They just finalized the agreement with Mercosur. They just finalized the updated version of the EU-Mexico agreement. So anyway, the whole point is that Trump coming back, and even if he goes crazy on tariffs, it's not the end of globalization. It's not the 1930s. It's essentially the United States shooting itself in the foot. Is there something we can do about that? Well, in the short run, not very much, but I would venture that eventually American voters will probably wake up and respond to it. So let me stop there.
Very good. Thank you very much. That's really fascinating analysis. And I mean, in the short term, these inflationary pressures could have very significant disruptive effects in a way that nobody's yet been thinking of. So thank you. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague here at the Europaeum, Dorian Singh, who's going to curate the next half an hour, which is essentially questions and answers. I can see that of the almost 100 people who are currently online, we have already about 10 or 11 questions. Over to you, Dorian.
Hi. Thank you all. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you to Anthony and Andrew. And it's really exciting to be here on this inaugural launch of the online seminars. And we hope that you will continue to join us for future events, both in person and online. And we've had some really interesting questions come in, not only in the chat, but a few from social media as well. So I'm going to try to group them as best I can. I think this could really be one for the entire group. It might be slightly more towards Leslie and Ian, but there have been a few questions specifically from Luis Vega, also from Sasha P, regarding generally resiliency, this question of resiliency, and what kind of levers and what kind of leverage do institutions, particularly in Europe, have to leverage against and to become resilient to illiberalism, creeping illiberalism in the United States. So Luis is particularly interested in questions about human rights. And so if we could maybe have a few comments and reflections on resiliency to illiberalism in the international sphere, specifically on human rights.
Is that for both of us, or?
Please, Leslie, please do.
So the resilience of the international system on the question of human rights. I mean, it's a very important question. It's a challenging and difficult question. I mean, I think the question of human rights has always been aspirational, and we, and left to ultimately the state to protect or fail to protect, despite the fact that we have numerous formal and informal, transnational and international mechanisms and institutions in place to facilitate protection of human rights. It's actually quite a weak governance system, as we all know. And the protection of human rights is, varied dramatically across states, across localities, across time. So I think that the first thing to say is that, we've always fall far short of our ideals, which even as those ideals have continued to increase over time. The concern that I have now is that the rhetorical commitment to those rights is actually also being eroded. And we talk a lot about hypocrisy, and there's a huge amount of human rights hypocrisy. But now, ironically or not ironically, the risk might be now that we don't actually have a human rights hypocrisy because people don't actually shoot for the standard. And that creates a different type of permissiveness, which is very concerning. So I guess I don't think that the international system per se has ever been especially resilient when it comes to the question of human rights. And that these things are, the respect for human rights has been very much linked to questions of war and peace, questions of economic growth and distribution and democracy and the rule of law. And so in the round, we're probably in a better circumstance with respect to human rights, simply because a lot of those rights are economic and social, and there's more development than there used to be. But in short-term relative terms, I'm actually quite concerned. It's a great and very big question.
It is. Suzanne, I know that you wanted to come in, and then Ian, of course, if you'd like to come in as well. So Ian, why don't you go, and then Suzanne, you can round out the question at the end.
Okay, I mean, it's a hugely important question. I mean, it's hard to be optimistic about this in the sense that, if you think of the United States as a driver of global thinking around these issues, I mean, certainly the Biden administration aspired to do that with its democracy agenda and other things. You could argue about how effective it was, but anyway, it was there. There was a rhetorical commitment to it. There were people who thought about it, and et cetera. That is absent now. I think you have a much sharper sort of focus on interests as a driver, and a kind of explicit rejection, in fact, I would say, of the kind of values-driven agenda. So where does that leave you? Well, not everyone's going to agree with that. Clearly, I think in Europe, there is still an attachment to the idea that Europe is in many ways a values, or the European project. The EU is a values proposition, values power. But I have to say, sitting in Brussels, I see some erosion even of the commitment to that idea here as well, and a more transactional approach taking hold. Again, who is the loser in all of, well, UN agencies who are devoted to this kind of approach, others. It will get rather tough because it also depends on money. And if you look at, for example, the decisions that are being taken regarding US aid, much of this is not just about aid and assistance in the sort of traditional developmental sense, but also about democracy promotion and media freedom and many other things like that. My organization's been very involved in things like that. It would really be very, very harmful if the US is no longer committed to and not funding that kind of work anymore.
Absolutely. Suzanne, please do come in.
Unmute myself. I think unfortunately, as Leslie has kind of already gestured at, an abstract universal human rights has never been attainable in practice, and whatever measly systems we've had, as far as I'm concerned, completely lie in shambles. And we should be very honest with how something even like the ICC warrants for Netanyahu's arrest can just be completely flouted. He can fly to the United States with impunity. This system is in tatters, and I don't think we do anyone any favors by kind of pretending that it is otherwise. And the only other thing I will add is that at the ideological level, there is, in the kind of post-liberal world that I work on, a really big pushback against the idea of universal human rights as an abstract principle. Right, and to say, no, actually, right, this is some sort of French revolutionary sort of abstract idealism. People only have, people are embedded in particular contexts. They're not equal, right? They assert that quite brazenly. They're not equal. They do not have some sort of universal abstract rights, and that bodies like the International Court of Justice or the ICC, the EU, the UN, anything that would kind of purport to guarantee those rights is just in a kind of instantiation of kind of an imperial framework that is kind of utilizing this sort of abstract theorizing in order to kind of come down tough on on whatever states kind of are asserting their own national sovereignty. So the attacks here are really practical, but they're also really ideological in a way. Somebody asked what makes the new right different than, say, the old right. I think this the abandonment, even at a kind of abstract ideological level, of the idea of the individual or individual rights is one of the kind of key things that I'd point to.
Thank you. Just to go on to a very easy question, leaving that one behind, we have a very specific question for Jakob on economics. Gary would like to know if you give credence to the notion that the threat of US tariffs may be a prelude to an agreement on longer term US dollar devaluation.
No, I think the short answer to that question is no. And the reason is threefold, I guess. First of all, the macroeconomics, as I said, of tariffs is inflationary. It will drive up US inflation. We can debate how much, but directionally, there's no doubt. It will cause US interest rates to rise, and that will strengthen the dollar, in fact. And I think that is what we will see if Trump actually goes ahead and pulls the trigger on tariffs. Secondly, if there's one political lesson that I think certainly the Trump administration has learned, but probably also the Democratic Party, and indeed democratic polities around the world. One thing we have seen quite uniquely in 2024 is that all incumbents lost. Well, why did they lose? Well, they lost for many reasons, but I would argue this is certainly also true for the US election, in my opinion. It had a lot to do with inflation. So for any government, much less the US government, because of this, where this is particularly difficult because of the particular role of the dollar, to negotiate somehow a managed decline of the dollar, value of the dollar, would be political suicide, in my opinion, for any administration that tried to do it. So I give very little credence to that argument. And certainly recent events, in my opinion, pushes even further in the other direction.
Thank you. So from a very, very specific and targeted question, we have now to the entire panel. So for whomever would like to take this, an interesting counterfactual, it's an anonymous question. Could Trump 2.0 presidency create any surprising or counterintuitive opportunities for global stability, or will it inevitably be disruptive? There's just a small counterfactual examination if anyone would like to wade in.
I mean, I'm sure, I think we'll all have an answer to this. I mean, look, yes, I mean, the answer is yes. In the foreign, let's just look at the foreign policy piece of this. I mean, this very mercurial, unpredictable, personality-driven approach, can produce all sorts of things. Now, I mean, you need to have circumstances that allow it, but you look at the Abraham Accords, you look at other sorts of things that happened in the first Trump administration. I could well imagine something happening, new deals as the president would like with Russia, even with China potentially. I think he's probably very attached to that kind of diplomacy. Personally, now that can take you to very bad places too, but it can also surprise us. I wouldn't dismiss that as a possibility.
Absolutely, that's very interesting. Would anyone else like to comment on this particular speculate?
I mean, I'll just really quickly say, I mean, I agree with Ian, right? I mean, Nixon could go to China in a way that like a Democratic president couldn't. And remember, when you're dealing with someone who doesn't have a kind of coherent set of ideological principles, there is some sort of kind of like flexibility for things to get kind of weird. On the Middle East, I think that whatever short-term stability that is secured, even via a kind of revivification of like the Abraham Accords, will be short-term kind of Pyrrhic victory, because any sort of settlement in the Middle East that does not actually address Palestinians is not going to ever be a secure, long-lasting one. And the Trump administration and the Abraham Accords framework is kind of by definition designed to not do that. So you may have these kind of short-term stability gains, but we should not fool ourselves to think that that is actually kind of getting to the root of these issues.
I guess I would just add that I do think that there are certain, I mean, I agree with what's been said, because there are some, it's sort of back to one of the things said in my initial marks, that if you, on the Middle East, if you don't really, the reason we've ended up where we, despite the fact that everybody points to the Abraham Accords as having been such a success, they did fundamentally ignore the question that has created very grave issues over the last 15 months, which isn't to take Hamas off the hook in any way, shape, or form, but it is to say that the Israel-Palestinian issue has to be treated seriously. But to the more general question, yeah, I do absolutely think that if you could pull out the good parts of somebody who is willing to not just follow convention without challenging it, who's willing to look at a situation and say it's not fair, or it's not working, or we need to change the way we do things, I think that there is an opportunity in that. Certainly, in the distributional gains of trade, for example, there's an opportunity in somebody who just wants to push a conversation. But you've got to have follow through and measure and empiricism attached to it, and political coalition building and all the rest of it. So this is what makes me more skeptical that the disruption can lead to that. The cost benefit calculus surrounding the disruption will be to the advantage of the benefit of all of us. That's my concern.
I mean, can I just add one little thing to that? I mean, disruption, you know, some people like to also talk about Trump's sort of weaponizing uncertainty. The problem with that argument in an economic sense is that for market participants, economic actors, who tends to deal in not necessarily real estate developers like Trump, who basically builds a house and sells it and walks away, but most economic actors tend to deal in, you know, iterative games or repeated transactions, and therefore like predictability. And for them, you know, this strategy that some say is Trump's great strength is an inherent, serious, potentially deadweight loss. And I'll just give you one example from this week to highlight that, which is that in response to the potential implementation of tariffs by Trump, you have seen a spike in gold prices. The distinction of the break between forward gold prices in New York and physical gold prices in London, because traders have actually shifted a lot of gold physically to the United States because they want to potentially front run this risk of tariffs. That implies real economic costs to real economic actors to basically try to, at some level, prepare themselves for what Trump may or may not do. So this idea that weaponized uncertainty is somehow free and somehow bestows a benefit to the United States and actors in the United States is simply nonsense.
Which actually sort of leads very well, this discussion of weaponization and weapons in general actually touches on the next sort of topic. A lot of questions coming in about defense writ large, but the questions, I'll sort of distill it. I mean, essentially, the questions are around, given Trump's sort of past skepticism of NATO multilateralism, the question is essentially, how real do you consider the threat of US disengagement from NATO? And can European security architecture realistically adjust to a reduced American role?
Well, I mean, if I may, I mean, you know, I actually think the chances of the United States withdrawing from the alliance are very, very slim. I mean, there are many reasons for that, both legal and political and practical. Not to mention the fact that it actually costs money to do things like that. And we saw that the last time around when Trump was trying to restructure the American military presence in Germany. I don't think that's happening. Will life get pretty rough inside NATO? Quite possibly, for all sorts of reasons. And there will be much sharper debates, I think, even if, as I say, you get defense spending up for reasons, some of which have to do with Trump, some of them driven by other things. What is going to count? But on the second part of that question, the actual ability of Europe to defend itself. I mean, look, I mean, nobody wants to live in a world where the United States is not a contributor to European security. That's not a good thing. And it would be very difficult, I think, whatever the commitment, for Europe as a whole to build a very credible defense industrial establishment in short order. You could, with sufficient commitment, and I know Jacob has thoughts about this too, but it takes a long time. And what are you building for? And what do anyway, there's lots of pieces that go into this thing. But no question, just to end, that the whole idea about European strategic autonomy and stronger defense, this is no longer just a kind of aspirational philosophical thing emanating from Paris. This has now got real edge to it, and it will be measured in very practical ways.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything Ian said. I mean, I guess I would just highlight that certainly it costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time to rebuild a quote unquote military industrial complex that Europe obviously, as it was enjoying the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, to some extent, let fall by the wayside. There is, however, one potential silver lining for Europe, and that, as I mentioned briefly in my introductory remark, is the potential for for full integration of Ukraine into the EU, including in the defense sector. Because Ukraine is actually rapidly emerging as a very significant defense production location. It's well known that they are probably today the world's largest producer of drones. The target, I believe, is 4 million drones this year. They're beginning to produce also other things. And obviously, from a simply defense procurement point of view, it's very cheap. I mean, there was an interesting article. I mean, this guy, Robertson, who basically tries to produce military purchasing power parity numbers, will show that if you adjust for differences in wages and investment costs, etc., that Ukraine has the highest PPP adjustment of everyone. Even higher than Russia itself. So if you want to produce a lot of weapons in Europe relatively cheaply, you pretty much got to do it in Ukraine.
May I just stick on Ukraine for a moment, only because it segues so nicely into questions that Sophie Verite, among others, have had. And there's just a lot of interest in having the panel, please, just sort of reflect on the potential impact of Trump's presidency on Russia's war, in whichever aspect you would like to take it. But a lot of interest in questions about that, if someone else would like to take another angle.
No, I mean, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think this war will be a disaster for Russia. It already is, in my opinion, obviously. And I take the view that actually, in the end, because Trump seems to be fully committed to peace, whatever that means, he can basically, but the problem is that neither Russia nor Ukraine at the moment, because Ukraine is fully funded, at least for the next 12 months, they're also relatively well supplied militarily. They have no interest in suing for peace at any costs. This is clearly true for Russia as well, because you can question whether the Russian war economy and Vladimir Putin's regime can survive peace, other than the complete subjugation of Ukraine. So Trump has to change that equilibrium. How does he do that? Well, he can try to cut off Ukraine, obviously. That will be fiercely resisted by Europe. Or he can try to weaken Russia. And if he chooses that, he can do it in two ways. He can obviously give Ukraine a lot of weapons. He might do that. That will probably cost money. He'll have to go to either get the Europeans to pay for it or go back to Congress, and or he can use a lot of extra sanctions on the Russian economy, especially oil, etc. I suspect he will do that, and ultimately, therefore, I think this war will turn out relatively favorable to Ukraine. For Ukraine, and it will be, for that reason, a strategic disaster for Russia, as well as China, and as well as all the, I guess, the two other countries that support Russia, namely, I mean, it already is a disaster for Iran, and it will probably also be so for North Korea.
Suzanne, please.
So I'm not sure if I'm entirely as optimistic as Jacob, actually, on particularly on the continuing funding for Ukraine from the United States, just because, I mean, and again, we have no idea how this will shake out and how these things actually move through Congress, but we should keep it on our radar that already, in October, I think it was, of 2023, and the end of October, J.D. Vance co-authors a kind of open letter with Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation, about decoupling aid for Israel from aid to Ukraine. and Vance, and in the kind of NatCon world that he comes from, they've been very, very increasingly opposed to aiding Ukraine. So this is one, this is not the only piece of the Republican coalition, but there is certainly a very large and I think increasingly vocal and increasingly influential kind of faction within the American right that views kind of funding of Ukraine war as kind of counter to American interests in some ways, and really a distraction from kind of going full China hawk, which is really what this kind of the NatCon universe would like to see. So yeah, none of us have kind of crystal balls, but just did want to kind of offer that as a note of kind of maybe qualification.
No, but I actually completely agree with that. But I don't think there is any need for additional US funding. It would be nice, but it's not necessary. And I would actually, if Donald Trump were to tell the Europeans, look, you fund it. If you want more patriots and whatever else from the United States, you have to pay for them. I think that would not be unreasonable. You might even say you should actually seize those 250 or whatever, $300 billion of Russian assets and pay me with them. I think that would be that would not be unreasonable in my opinion. So I would absolutely agree with you. I think it would be very difficult for Donald Trump to go back to Congress because of all the reasons within the Republican Party that you mentioned, but I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, okay.
Leslie or Ian, would you care to come in on Russia, Ukraine, or? Sure. Okay.
Well, I mean, just a quick,
please do,
quick comment. I was thinking Leslie might come in. I mean, look, I mean, I agree with what Jacob has said, but if Trump is really going to, is serious about, pressing for a settlement or at least a ceasefire, I mean, clearly this cannot just be about territory. I mean, there are going to be other things on the table. I mean, it's sticks, but it's also some carrots that have to be in that mix. And, there are bigger pictures and packages that one can imagine where Russia may have some incentives to get out from under sanctions. Ukraine will look for security guarantees. There are all kinds of things that aren't about, the line of control and the line of contact and where it is. It's, there are other things at stake, and, who knows, to go back to your question earlier about what could be disruptive, well, those things could be.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is that, I agree with what's been said about US funding, that it seems very unlikely for all the reasons that we've heard. But in any case, it's difficult to see a stable solution emerging. And it does feel like this will continue to be an unsettled, not even frozen, at best, a low-level conflict for a very long period of time. And so Europe's role in trying to continue to deter and stabilize the situation is going to be an ongoing one. We all want to talk about, I don't mean on the call, but in general, in the public conversation, everybody wants to talk about a deal, but a deal is just sort of, it's the temporary first step in what is going to be a very enduring and long-term problem. And was before, but obviously it's categorically different now.
Thank you. I'm aware of the time, but I thought we could sort of bring things together with just sort of a final question. It's sort of an amalgamation of a number of questions. So open it up to the entire panel, whoever would like to reflect on this. How would you rate the risk that Trump's reemergence will embolden authoritarian leaders around the world, or do you anticipate it having the opposite effect? In other words, could a second Trump presidency shift the global balance towards or away from illiberalism globally? Just as a final sort of reflective question, if people want to think about that broadly or in any sort of particular aspect that might be interesting to them.
I will just very quickly see, it depends entirely, in my opinion, on Ukraine. If Trump abandons Ukraine, every authoritarian leader in the world will be greatly emboldened, not least Xi Jinping on Taiwan. If Trump the European helps defeat Russia, I think the opposite will be the outcome.
I'll come in. this is the first thing I disagree on. I don't think for the rest of the world it's all about Ukraine. I think what the rest of the world has been saying the entire time is that they're very used to wars. They're very used to not having a salvation or a solution for wars, certainly not the attention that Europe or the US, has put on the Ukraine war. And so there's in much of the world, there's a disregard for this war as being categorically different. And that feeling, I think, has been exacerbated by the war in Gaza and the US position with respect to Israel. I don't, on the broader question, I think I'm a medium-term optimist. And a short term, I think it's hard to know and it's uncertain. But I think that, very few things are linear. And regardless of what Trump does in the next 4 years, that it will also generate a lot of pushback and reaction, and that there are plenty of forces for illiberalism and plenty of forces for liberalism. And I imagine that contest will be complex and hard to capture. And, as wrong as we were about the end of history, we would, I imagine, be equally wrong about kind of saying the end of liberalism.
Yeah. I mean, if I may, and I think, Suzanne will certainly have interesting thoughts on this one because this is really your thing. But, I just think, look, I mean, this is a complex equation and there are drivers of, Jacob mentioned this earlier, incumbents losing all over the place. I mean, there are clearly some common drivers of these political outcomes on both sides of the Atlantic, but also globally. But it's a complex equation. But on balance, I mean, if you had to bet, I have to think that this outcome will at least create a more permissive environment for liberal governments and regimes everywhere, because there will simply be fewer people looking over their shoulder. I think that's probably true, and I think some of the geopolitical pieces of this also press in that direction. I mean, you have to think that what is unfolding over Greenland has got to be encouraging to Beijing when it comes to Taiwan. I mean, so we can find a lot of different examples. Finally, I mean, I'm not sure that these outcomes have put to rest the risk of political violence in the United States, and in fact, in other democracies. Lots of people are rightly concerned about that. And I can imagine, regardless of these outcomes, seeing a rise in that risk, which, anyway, it leads us into a separate kind of question, but I would end on that.
Can I come back to Ian on just one thing? Ian, you might have a response to this, but, we've had 18 years, according to Freedom House, of freedom, and I understand it's a particular measure, but if you take it for what it is having some value, 18 years of backsliding on that basket of freedoms that's broadly referred to as being democratic. And those years came under Obama, right? 2 terms of Obama. It hasn't all been Trump. And so it's not clear, maybe we've been heading in that direction already, but it's also, it's not clear that the driver is the President of the United States of America.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, it's a very good point. But, there's also a question of sort of pace and scale here. It's a little bit like the analogy that's made with bankruptcies. How did that happen? Well, slowly and then very quickly. So, there may be a political equivalent to that. It probably does matter, at least as a model, where the United States goes. But I would fully agree with your point that the United States isn't necessarily the key agent of resilience in this regard.
Well, Suzanne, given the nature of this final question, I think it's appropriate that you'll have the final word. And may I also add, there's an anonymous participant who would like to add a writer onto this question for you answer. And they're particularly curious about a comment on whether or not you see NatCon rising in the global south or third world, for lack of a better term. So if you could just maybe add that in, that'd be great. Thank you.
So I'm trained as a historian, which means I have a I treat liberalism as a historical period, and in that sense, it actually can come to an end. It's very different than the end of history in that in the idea that there was no further ideological, development that was going to be possible. And in my mind, in my eyes, honestly, we are at this kind of inflection point, and the problem is we're not, even those of us like myself who are kind of critics of many aspects of this liberal regime, like we don't want to throw the whole thing out. Right? We're quite attached to things like international, right? That idea of international human rights or the rule of law, right? A free and fair judiciary. All of these kind of things have been bequeathed to us by liberalism. But I think again, we don't do ourselves any favors by thinking that what we have had can be saved. I really do think that world is gone, and in some ways it's like a victim of its kind of own actualization, because right everywhere that they've been embraced, and really to a degree corresponding with their degree of social penetration, neoliberal policies have created this crisis of legitimacy for democratic states and have driven people into the arms of anti-establishment demagogues who are willing to give expression to that kind of frustration and to say, yes, this status quo is degraded, it is unsustainable, that you do live with this kind of perpetual insecurity, which people reflect consistently and increasingly. So to grapple with this means acknowledging there is no returning to normal, and that these crises that in 1989 seem to be confined to developing countries of the global south have kind of indeed come home to roost. So in a very strange way, right, if history is back, if we want to keep that framing, it's returned in the form of these kind of conditions that have like long been associated with post-colonial states, war, refugees, debt burdens, environmental degradation, right? Yes, hucksters and strongmen abusing political power for their own enrichment, right? Declining independence of judiciaries, right? So on and so forth, right? We even had our own coup attempt in the United States. So, I mean, I just think that if we really believe that international law and institutions are going to play a crucial role in creating and sustaining a kind of peaceful and inhabitable planet, we need to think kind of honestly about kind of creating and shaping a new sort of international order for the 21st century, rather than bemoaning the one that's currently lying in the morgue. And that we should just be very open about these failures, what has led to these failures, and the impossibility of a kind of return. And so that, again, I do think that we are kind of entering into this kind of post-liberal world, and that to kind of answer the question directly, that will give a lot of strength to kind of illiberal forms of government, whether they call themselves democracies or not. The world over, they will certainly not be based on the principle of individual rights, right? They kind of have elevated this idea of collective rights or collective freedom, national freedom, as a substitute for individual rights. And I think you'll see a lot more of that. And kind of in terms of kind of NatCon's penetration, it's very selective still, but just this last year in 2024 was the first time that India kind of sent its own delegation to a NatCon convention. So you're starting to see that kind of movement. There's definitely kind of been outreach to Javier Milei and kind of other kind of parts of the right populist in South America. So, in the Philippines as well. So yes, I would expect to see that kind of the global network kind of illiberal rulers continue to kind of incorporate those within the global South, and offer them this, idea of kind of nationalism in the nation state and national sovereignty as a substitute to those of kind of the liberal principles that we're used to.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. It was sobering, but I think also very clear-eyed and a very frank and honest conversation covering a lot of topics. I'm very grateful to everyone for their time. I'm going to hand back over to my colleague, Anthony and Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Dorian. Thank you to all four speakers, to Leslie, to Suzanne, to Ian, to Jakob. It's been a really great, very stimulating discussion. Just to say that we may be witnessing the end of liberalism, but we won't be witnessing the end of this seminar, because it will live on in two forms. First of all, the various speakers have very kindly agreed to write 500 words apiece for the next edition of the New European. But more importantly, perhaps even than that, the video of this will be put up on YouTube, and so many more people hopefully have a chance to listen to the insights which we have shared in this very privileged way today. I'm now going to pass over to Andrew, who's going to draw the threads together before we close. Andrew.
Well, time is pressing, and I think any attempt to draw the threads together would be impossible. I'm also going to have to be unusually restrained, and I have thoughts on about, almost every speaker, fascinating every single speaker, agreed and disagreed very strongly with lots of things, but it would be going on far too long to, I had about 6 points, and I thought, no, cut it. We're at the end. Those will have to be done some other time, get back in again. Just an extraordinarily stimulating event. And the fact that I want to go on talking, it must be a good sign. I hope people are still listening, even though we've run over time. I hope they felt it's been good. So I'm just going to say, I'll try and see whether the new European will carry 500 words from me, saying the things that I might have said. But I wish you all the very best, and thank you very much indeed for an extremely stimulating first one of these quarterly online seminars. And thank you to Anthony and Dorian and all the people who've set it up. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. And we'll be continuing this process, as Andrew suggests, about once a quarter with different issues related to major public policy challenges and to leadership issues in the modern world. But in the interim, a huge thank you to all of our speakers, and a huge thank you also to all those who've been online and have shared this experience, and look forward to seeing you next time. So thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.